If you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Matthew, the 5th chapter. That's my text is taken from this evening. Been a beautiful day, hasn't it? And it's good to see everyone here. Hope you enjoyed your afternoon. Some people like to sleep on Sundays, take a little nap. Others just like to eat. I kind of like to do a mixture of some of that, but whatever it is, it's always good to come and worship God. So we're very blessed to be able to be here tonight. It's not uncommon, as we live in the world, for people to give various titles or descriptions of places. Some people will call a beautiful place, they'll say, well, that's the promised land. And someone else will say, well, that's really the land of rest. And we do things with people as well. We give them descriptive titles. You might ask somebody, well, what do you think about Garland there? And they'll say, oh, he's good as gold. Have you ever heard someone say that? Or if he says it, you can take it to the bank. Other sayings that people will say, they'll say, well, they're just the salt of the earth. Everyone in their family's like that. And then sometimes I've had people say, well, they're wishy-washy. Now, that's not a good thing for people to say about you. But in Matthew 5, the Bible gives descriptive terms of God's people. And Jesus mentions something about what we are in this world. Now, in verse 13, he talks about salt. But I want you to notice verse 14. He says, ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. So if I'm a child of God, if I'm a Christian, I'm the light of the world. You're the light of the world. Now, it's interesting, in Genesis, the first chapter, Jehovah's first recorded words, if you look in Genesis 1:3, it says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. So, when you talk about light, we all understand that it's something that is essential, something we have to have. The vegetable kingdom, animal kingdom, all humans, we understand the importance of light. And Jesus is saying that ye are the light of the world. Now, if you really bring that home and take it to if he's just speaking to you, and you pretend like you're the only one, and sometimes I think that's good, because otherwise we say, well, someone else will do that or this. We need to get the mentality of here am I, send me, that kind of mentality. And when Jesus says you're the light of the world, there's some essential things we need to remember about light. Now in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, one of them is, if you'll go with me there, light, first of all, must be rightly focused. And in Colossians 3, we learn there in verse 1 where we're to keep our focus. It says, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. Now, while Jesus said, ye are the light of the world, if you go to John and you look there in the 8th chapter, we find that Jesus himself is a true light. We're simply reflective light. He said in verse 12, then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. But in Matthew 5, he said, ye are the light of the world. Jesus is the true light. And in order for our light to be what it ought to be, we have to have it focused. Now, if you've ever tried to do anything in the dark and you grab a light, it does no good whatsoever if you don't point the light in the direction of what you're trying to do, does it? It's useless. And I remember years ago, my father would work on a car. He would look under a car, and he would raise the hood, and he used to have one of those, neat little lights that would hang. Donnie and them know what I'm talking about. He's probably got a bunch of them there. My granddaddy was a mechanic. One of them was, and he must have given it to Daddy. And Daddy would say, shine it down here where I can see it, son. And see, the light did no good if I was shining it over here. And we need to remember that. We're the light of the world, but we have to remember we have to be focused. We have to be focused. And Christians really have to stay focused on Christ, the true light, something else. A light has to have a clean surface, doesn't it? If you ever grab a flashlight and it's dirty, what do? Well, you clean it off. And when you look in James 1, we learn in verse 27 that James tells us that we are, there in verse 27, he says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. And so we're to have a clean surface. If I want my light to shine, then I not only must be focused, but I better make sure that I'm clean in that sense. I'm not spotted by the world. Remember Demas? Remember what Paul said about him in 2 Timothy? It said Demas, well, it's 2 Timothy 4. If you look there in verse 10, he said, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. And you can read the rest of it. 1 John 2 tells us we're not to love the world. So I've got to have a clean surface. And then if you go with me to Luke 8, another essential thing for light is it has to have a good background as a reflector. Now, as a Christian, our background is our hearts. And in the parable of the sower in Luke 8, if you look there in verse 15, he says, but that on the good ground are they which in an honest heart and good heart, having heard the word, keep it and bring forth fruit with patience. So light is essential, and it must be focused, must have a clean surface. Our hearts must be what they are. We need to keep them clean, pure, if we're going to reflect the true light, which is Christ. Now, when you talk about some things light does, we all understand. We know light illuminates, doesn't it? Light also can warm. Have some other things that it can do. It banishes darkness. Now, that's pretty simple. When you wake up in the morning, if you're like me, I don't turn any lights on if I wake up before Carrie does. And it takes a little bit for that night vision to kick in, doesn't it? There for a while, what are you doing? You're walking, at least I do, I'm walking like this. But if I turned on the light, boom, everything would just be perfect. Kids understand that. When a child discovers what a light switch can do, just the amazement in their face, I'm always amazed at what they'll just play with it for hours because they don't understand it. Light does that. It guides, it warns of danger, it awakens. My dad never could sleep if any type of light was shining. We had a camper, and it had a red light on one of the instruments, a radio or something, and I remember him taping that thing up because if it shined on him, it'd wake him up. And that's what light does. It awakens. It awakens. Does some other things. Makes itself visible. That's why Jesus said, ye are the light of the world. Now you may say, well, that's good and well, but how can Christians be the light of the world? Let me mention some simple things. You've can probably think of others, but one is, if you go with me to Ephesians, the 4th chapter, this is something that normally we don't think much about. We talk to our kids a lot about it, but our language. Do you know by the very words you use, people can learn a lot about you. Now, if you have a computer problem and you're like me and you dial a number, I always get someone in another country. Can't understand them. And it does me no good whatsoever. I always say I want to speak to an American. Finally, they get me to someone who can understand English. And our language out in the world says a lot about what we are. And in Ephesians 4, look at verse 29. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace into the heaven. Here's. Now in James, James talked quite a bit about the tongue. And it's very tempting when we're in the world, especially when people first obey the gospel. One of the struggles they encounter is they used to talk like their friends and their buddies. And it's hard for them not to use bad language. It's a struggle. Oftentimes they use that as an excuse not to obey the gospel. But what you have to understand is it takes time. It takes time to grow and put that out of your life. James mentioned how important it is. Look at James 1:26. If any man among you seem to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain. And then the words of Jesus always make me think. I pray a lot during the day about just opening my mouth, believe it or not. I say things, and oftentimes I wished I hadn't. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said in Matthew 12. Look at verse 36. He said, but I say unto you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. You know, my attitude ought to be what David said. Remember in Psalms 19? I think it's verse 14. He said, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer. Well, let me ask you something. Do the words that come out of your mouth and my mouth tell those around us that we are light from the true light? In times of sorrow, what do we say? In times of adversity, when we're happy, when we're sad, when you hit your thumb with a hammer because you're trying to hammer something, or when you stub your toe. About the worst thing I ever heard my grandfather say was, that's enough to make a preacher cuss. Every year he got kicked. It couldn't be the same calf, but we sold him. But a calf always kicked him in the same shin on the same leg every year. And he would holler, and he would say, that's enough to make a preacher cuss. But can people, when they hear us, can they, by our language, how we act when something happens, what we say, does it want them to be more like the master we serve? See, it's a good question, because our language says quite a bit about us. And then our daily walk. If you go to Ephesians, the 5th chapter, not only does my speech show that I'm letting my light shine, and also using phrases like good Lord willing, you'd be surprised how you can get a Bible study or talk about the Bible with a coworker by simply saying, good Lord willing. I'll see you after lunch, good Lord willing. I had a fellow one time say, you know the Lord. Well, your conversation goes from there. But my speech would do no good without the life I'm living. And that's what in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, look at verse 15. See then that ye walk circumspectly. Now this is the King James, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Now walk circumspectly, that means be careful. Walk carefully. Walk carefully. Someone drops a plate in the kitchen. What do we tell the rest of the family members? Don't come in here barefooted. Why? We've all said, because you don't want them to get glass in their feet. We tell them to be careful. And he's telling us here that we should be careful. And there's reasons why. If you look at 1 Peter 4, they were having the same problem that people have today. You obey the gospel, you've come out of that darkness, you're in the world, you're doing what Jesus said, ye are the light of the world. You're trying to speak like Jesus wants you to. You're trying to live like he wants you to. In 1 Peter 4, in verse 3, he said, for the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. And notice what he says these people do. Look at verse 4. Wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of right, speaking evil of you. You ever had someone do that? You're different. The question is, do people see in your life, in my life, that something or someone has changed us? They can see it in our speech, and they can see it in our actions. You know, we talk about Jesus being the true light. You know this, but some might not. We are reflective light, just like the moon. The moon was out early last night. We were looking at it while we were eating supper. And when you talk about the moon, it gets its light, of course, from the sun. Now, when the earth comes between the sun and the moon, that's known as a total eclipse. Well, what happens is, to many Christians, when the world comes between them and Christ, what you have is a spiritual eclipse, you see? Because now you're no longer able to reflect from the true light. And so we have to be careful. We cease to shine at that point. So how brightly I shine determines how close I am to Jesus, the true light, and how separated and far away I am from the world. People need to see that. And we need to realize, if we look at Mark's account, go to Mark 4, he kind of says it a different way here. He mentions a candle. But he gives us an idea of our arch enemy, the devil. How is the devil going to stop you and stop me from letting our light shine? Because he doesn't want anybody to be saved, does he? And he's trying to bring down each and every one of us. Jesus, in verse 21, says, "And he said unto them, Is a candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not to be set on a candlestick? He says, For there is nothing hid which should not be manifested, neither was anything kept secret, but that it should come abroad." But if you look at that in verse 21, we sing the little song, "This Little Light of Mine." I mean, I don't sing it at home, but I mean, we sing it with the kids. You've probably done it here. You'll have kids in VBS or somewhere, and you sing, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." And then we always go, "Hide it under a bushel," and they shout no. And when you talk about hiding it under a bushel, that was a measure of grain that was used in business and commerce. Actually, the devil knows that we can hide our light in the same way, by getting caught up in the business and the work of the world. How many times have you talked to someone who has quit coming to service? And you talk to them and they go, "Well, I can't help it. I had to work. I had to work." And you go, "Well, you had to work every Sunday?" And oftentimes they'll pull out, "Well, now, preacher, 1 Timothy 5, I'm supposed to support my family. I'm supposed to take care of them." But you see, if I'm not careful, the devil's very tricky. And what he'll do is he'll get me to hide my light under the disguise of work. Go back to Luke in the parable of the sower. Jesus mentioned this in Luke 8. We read verse 15, but let's go up to verse 14. He said, "And that which fell among the thorns are they which, when they have heard, go forth and are choked with the cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to perfection." There is nothing the devil wants more to keep your life from shining than to get you so engulfed and enwrapped in your job that that's all you do is you work. And I feel sorry for those people at Kmart. Carrie was over there the day that they found out. And then I went the next day and talked to Brother Pat Organ, one of the elders over at Oak Avenue. He works there. And I began to think, because I've often said this, people have told me I'd be scared to death to be a preacher, and I'd say, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, those elders would call you in there and fire you any Sunday, any Wednesday." Have you ever heard people say that? They discourage young people from being preachers. And I've always said, I'd say, "Listen, you can lose your job too. You can lose." No. Well, that is a classic example, is it not? They didn't find out till that day. And that's it. And the devil knows that. We could read 1 Timothy 6, where we're told that we're not supposed to love money, we're to be content. And he says, well, let's just read it. He said there in 1 Timothy 6, he said, but godliness, in verse 6, with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out, and having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. A lot of people will read this, and they'll get to verse 9 and 10 and say, well, I don't love money. I don't love money. But then you just work, and you work, and you work, and your life slowly goes out. Why? Well, what happens? Look at verse 9. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Then he says, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some have coveted after, have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So the devil knows that we're the light of the world. Jesus is the true light. He wants to put your light, my light, out. He doesn't want us shining. He wants people in darkness. So if he can keep me preoccupied with things of the world, more, then my light will go out. One other simple thing he can do, if you go back to Mark, he mentioned the bushel there in Mark 4, but notice they're talking about the candle. He also said in verse 21, put it under the bed. If you look there, it says, and the candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed. Now, you say, well, we wouldn't put our light under a bed, but the devil knows that I can put my light under the bed of ease and indifference, can I not? That was done. You'll remember the church at Laodicea. Remember Revelation, the 3rd chapter? Most everyone knows about you talk about the 7 churches of Asia, and they'll say, oh, yeah, that church at Laodicea. The one that spewed out, and they go, oh, yeah, Jesus going to spew them out of their mouth. Notice what he said there. Verse 15, I know thy works, thou art neither cold nor hot. In other words, they were just indifferent. I would that thou were cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I'll spew thee out of my mouth. Remember James 4:17 tells us, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not. What is it? To him it is sin. So the devil knows that he's going to put my light, your light out, by doing those 2 simple things. There's many more you could come up with. But if he can get me to be indifferent, if he can get me to be occupied with getting the biggest house I can possibly get, best car I could possibly have, all that takes money. How do you get money? You got to work. And there's nothing wrong with work. It's commanded. But it can become my God if I'm not careful. So tonight, when you talk about you are the light of the world, ask yourself, will this world be a better place when you leave? For the short time you're here, have you made a difference? Have you let your light shine? As Jesus said, ye are the light of the world. Will someone be led from darkness by your light to the true light, Jesus? And if not, then we need to resolve tonight to start not to let our lights go out, not to let our lights dim. What do you do in a flashlight when you turn it on and it's not as bright anymore? They say, well, go get the batteries, honey. And where are the batteries anyway? And that's the way it goes in our house. Then we get in it, and then I'm driving to get the batteries. But I had an elder one time when I was growing up. He used to always say that he would go to church and it would charge his batteries up to be around the brethren. Hebrews 10:25. We use it to say not forsake the assembly, but it says exhorting one another. Some of you won't be here Wednesday night. But if the Lord wills, we ought to be, because you get drained by the world. Temptations. And you come back and you get charged up. You get charged up and get your light shining. Because the world is in darkness. It's in the darkness of ignorance, superstition. It's in sin, and it's leading to outer darkness. And Jesus, sometimes we look at the apostles, and we think, wow, he chose 12 men to take the gospel to the whole world. But if you look in the Bible, how often did Jesus or how often did God just use one person to accomplish what he wanted accomplished? And they might not have had the faith in themselves, and they might make excuses, but eventually, if they let God use them, he would accomplish his goal. And he has a purpose for you and me. And we still have that purpose. We're to let our lights shine. So don't let anybody put your light out tonight. And it may be you're not even walking in the light. 1 John 1 says that if you're walking in the light, you have fellowship with God. Well, that comes through obedience to the gospel. In Acts, the 2nd chapter, they said, what should we do? They had already heard. They believed. Peter said, you need to repent. We know they confessed from other verses, and then they were buried in the waters of baptism. And you can do that. Verse 47, the Lord added them to the church, the body. They were in the light. And then when you sin, if you go back to 1 John 1 and read 7 through 9, since you're in the light, the blood's there. I've had people say, you mean I got to get rebaptized? You ever had people ask you that? You say, no. The blood's available. All you do is pray and you're forgiven. Now, it's not the windshield wiper effect like some of the Calvinists teach. You don't have to repent from the sin. That's what they say. That's why once saved, always saved. That blood's just doing this all the time. You can do whatever. It's not that. You have to confess it to God and repent of it. So tonight, if you're not a Christian, why not become one and be the light that Christ says you ought to be? He needs you. He needs you. And we need you as well. Will you do it?